So this week on the ToddCast Time Machine, obviously I'm looking, look, it is hard to ignore December 7th. So I'm not going to ignore December 7th. I'm going to lean in to December 7th, but I'm going to do it in a slightly different way than you might expect. Because what December 7th did is it shifted us from a nation that listened together. It was the beginning of something where we were a nation that listened together. Now we are a nation that listens alone. So I'm kind of starting with December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. We at least have read about the shock. We don't remember the shock, right? We weren't there. Most of us weren't alive for that moment. That's listening here. Some of you were, but most of us won't, right? At this point in time, right? If no baby boomer in theory, right? If you think about the entire baby boomer generation, the first ones were born in 1945. So in theory, none of them were alive, right? That's how few people. It's hard to believe that, but that's how few people. So we remember the tragedy, and of course, it was a turning point in American history and in world history. But Pearl Harbor also is the greatest single demonstration of the power of shared media in American life. What do I mean? Well, in 1941, more than 80% of American households had a radio. And for many families, that radio was the most valuable object in the house, the most valuable thing they owned that didn't have four wheels attached to it, obviously a car, right? And on the morning of December 7th, the entire nation turned into that same medium at the same time. They heard the president, they heard the bulletins, and of course, they heard the war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
And you heard it with everyone else. It was a shared experience. Radio wasn't just dominant, it was the national hearth, if you will. I mean, literally, right? Those fireside chats. We were all sitting around the radio to find out what our president knew, what he could tell us. Country had one soundtrack, one voice, one shared experience. This is the height of communal media in America. But 4 years later, this same week in history, we had our first crack in communal media. The first crack appeared, and it comes from a place no one was watching. On December 1st, 1945, the FCC quietly approved a massive expansion of what was called the FM broadcast ban. To most Americans, this meant zip. But it would eventually change everything about what we listened to and how. A few things happened because of this decision. One, we ended up with more choice. At the time of this ruling, the United States had just 48 FM stations. Within 10 years, that number exploded to over 500, a tenfold increase. Remember, AM radio was the initial radio. Suddenly, radio wasn't one monolithic block. We actually had a menu of options. And there were a whole bunch of new formats. We had musical formats, jazz, classical, album rock, adult contemporary, soft rock. FM created the space for niche music programming, the beginning of fragmentation, something we're all familiar with now. FM sound quality was so much better than AM that listeners began choosing stations based not on personality, but on clarity and fidelity. This was true in the car I grew up in. My dad wanted to listen to some AM radio guys, but hated the sound quality, so we ended up listening to more FM radio. By 1978, just before our next big milestone, which I'm going to get to in a minute, FM overtook AM for the first time. It commanded 58% of all listening in the United States. The communal world that had existed at the time of Pearl Harbor was already beginning to split. More stations, more formats, more choice. The era of everyone listening to the same thing was slowly dying. But choice is one thing. Personal choice, boy, that is something else. And that wouldn't arrive for decades in the form of a tiny blue plastic cassette player with foam headphones. If Pearl Harbor was the height of shared listening and FM was the beginning of fragmentation, then the moment that truly ended the broadcast era arrived in the summer of 1980, when Sony quietly introduced the Walkman into the United States. There wasn't a big launch event. There was no splashy TV campaign, no Steve Jobs style reveal, if you will. It had been introduced about a year earlier in Japan. But for $150, you too could have a personal stereo. It was about $500 in today's money, by the way. And it was just slipped onto American shelves. And guess what? It sold out almost instantly. Sony expected to sell 5,000 units a month. Instead, they sold over 30,000 units in the first 2 months, a number that shocked even Sony's executives. And why? Because for the first time ever, millions of Americans experienced private entertainment. The Walkman wasn't a radio, it wasn't a stereo, it wasn't a boombox. It was a portable, personal bubble, a soundtrack you controlled, songs you chose, moments you curated. No DJ, no commercials, no shared listening, no mass experience. Just whatever you wanted to hear, whatever you put together. This was the beginning of a personalization revolution, one that arguably we're still in the middle of. And I'll tell you this, once Americans got a taste, that's something about it, right? The more choices you give us, the more choices we demand. So that gives us, and this is a moment that I think people need to understand the current media landscape. If you follow the death of radio, then you will understand what is happening right now to cable news and broadcast television. So the Walkman, it didn't kill radio overnight. And no video didn't kill the radio star. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. But just like streaming didn't kill cable overnight, it all starts slowly, then it accelerates, then it becomes irreversible. So here's what happened. Familiar pattern. And again, we're talking about FM radio. Young listeners fled first. Radio listening among 12 to 24-year-olds fell 20% during the 80s, the exact decade when the Walkman took over. That's my decade, folks, when I was that age. And yep, I knew what time WSHE 103.5 in Miami was going to get the let out, which meant I was going to get 30 minutes of Led Zeppelin songs I had not owned yet, and I wanted to tape them. So I would tape them and then have them magically for myself, right? Without having to pay a dime. That was the other part of this, right? That was the other thing. Parents, my dad wasn't giving me the money. I had to do the Columbia House crap. That's how I sort of built my own music catalog. So there we were in the 80s. Car listening completely changed. Cassette listening in cars went from almost nothing in 1980 to 40% of all in-car listening by 1990, right? Like, it's like what happened. We first had radio, and then suddenly we had CDs, and then suddenly now your phones connect. When was the last time, ask yourself, that you used your installed car radio to listen to something? I'm going to guess if you did, it's probably like me, listening to a ball game on the way home quickly because you vaguely remembered where you heard play-by-play for whatever sports team you remembered, but that might be it. But this is happening. This is how we lost FM radio. So 4 in 10 moments spent in the car were suddenly not radio moments. In 1979, Arbitron tracked roughly a dozen major music formats, and by the late 90s, there were more than 40. Radio was trying to adapt to a world where audiences were no longer captive. They were trying to stave off this revolution. So they tried things like talk radio. From 1980 to the mid-90s, talk radio's audience grew 300%. Music abandoned AM entirely, and AM clung to political talk as its remaining asset. It's exactly the same way broadcast TV today clings to live sports and cable news clings to talking heads. So, Walkman, Discman, MP3 players, iPod, iPhone. By 1986, Sony had sold almost 10 million Walkmans. By the end of the product line, the Walkman finally had passed 220 million units sold worldwide. Radio never recovered from what started in 1980. It aged, it shrank, it fractured, just like television is doing right now. So, the modern parallel. TV is just radio 2.0. Everything we watched happen to radio after 1980 is almost exactly what we're watching happen to cable and broadcast TV today, right? When unified, fragmented, personalized, and collapsed, right? Let's compare. Radio, Pearl Harbor unifies, FM creates choice, Walkman personalizes, radio collapses, okay? 1941 is the unifying moment, 45 is the beginning of choice, 1980 is the Walkman, 90s and 2000s, radio dies. Television, 9/11 unifies, right? We all were watching the same news channels in 2001. The DVR creates some choice in the 2000s, smartphone personalizes, TV collapses in the 2020s, right? Let's just go to here, cable households. In 2011, we had 105 million households that had access to cable television. Today, it's about 60 million. That's a 45% collapse in a decade. And I promise you more is coming. The broadcast TV median viewer age in 1993 was 41. Today, it is nearly 60. In cable news, it is now at 70. For Americans under 30, over 60% of all video consumption happens on smartphones. So just like the Walkman destroyed the idea of shared listening, the smartphone has destroyed the idea of shared viewing. We don't watch the same shows. We don't see the same ads. We don't get the same news. We don't share the same reality. We're all walking around with our own private feeds, just like the Walkman owners walked around with their own private soundtracks. We now took it to everything else in life. So this week in history gives us a 3-step evolution of American media. You didn't see that I was going to start with Pearl Harbor and go to media route, right? December 7th, 1941. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It's a peak of shared communal broadcast experience. Americans united around one broadcast. 1945, we get FM expansion, by the way, in this same week in history. And that's the beginning of choice, of specialization, if you will, of niches, fragmentation. In some ways, it is what FM radio was in 1945 is what cable TV was in the 80s. Then the summer of 1980, we get the Walkman, and it's the birth of full-on personalized media. And once we put those foam headphones on, we've never really taken them off. We're now always at least got one ear with this. Our personalization eras began, radio cracked, television's cracking, and the entire media environment is built around the logic of the Walkman. My feed, my soundtrack, my show, my news. So there you have it. Pearl Harbor, this week in history, is Pearl Harbor, and not an insignificant moment. But what is interesting is when you think about the moment through the lens of media and what 1941 was and where we are today, it has been one giant, fast revolution in how we consume content in not just this country, in the world. So there you go. There's your moment in the time machine. There's a reason results matter more than promises. Just like there's a reason Morgan & Morgan has become America's largest injury law firm. For the last 35 years, they've recovered $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. It includes cases where insurance companies offered next to nothing, short of shortchanging, seeing if they could get away with it. And Morgan & Morgan fought back, and they won millions. In Pennsylvania, one client was awarded $26 million. It was a staggering 40 times the amount that the insurance company originally offered. That offer, $650,000, whatever it took to sort of get away without paying. So with more than 1,000 lawyers across the country, Morgan & Morgan knows how to deliver for everyday people. So if you're injured, you're looking for a lawyer, check out forthepeople.com/Toddcast or dial pound law, pound 529 on your cell phone. And remember, all law firms are not the same. So give Morgan & Morgan a look. Their fee is free unless they win.